Hey everybody, we're going to start a discussion of the Industrial Revolution. This is a huge topic, covers a lot of stuff. I'm not even going to attempt to cover everything in the Industrial Revolution in one video, so I'm going to try to split it into two. All right, so let's start us off with the first question you need to have an answer for is the Industrial Revolution, why does it start in England? So obviously I'm bearing the lead. The Industrial Revolution starts in England. All right, this is where this is the first country to go through this period of industrialization. What does the word industrialization mean? Well, industrialization, you hear the word industry in it. It's another way of saying how this is the period where instead of making goods by hand and making them slowly in their home, this is where the economy shifts, where goods are going to start being made by machine. And instead of goods being made in the home, they are going to start being made more and more in factories. And this has a huge impact. The Industrial Revolution is one of these changes that has huge political, social, economic, and environmental ramifications. It's going to affect everything, okay? All different parts of life. So again, why England, though? Out of all the places in the world, how come this move to industrialize starts here? And there's a couple of reasons. The first thing you need to look at is the food. Oddly enough, before you can get stuff done in a factory, you need to make sure you can feed people. Look, you guys are all from Queens. You're all city folk, right? So if you need food, it's not like you can grow it in your backyard. There's no way you can grow enough food to support yourself once you start living in the city. If you're living in Manhattan in an apartment and things like that, there's no way. You need somebody else out in a farm somewhere to grow enough food to send it into the city so that you don't starve to death, all right? And that's one of the key things. Before you can have an industrial revolution, you need an agricultural revolution. You need to make food, you need a huge supply of food, and that food needs to be grown in a way that is very efficient, okay? It needs to be grown in a way where there's high productive, that farms are going to be very, very productive with fewer workers, all right? And if you can accomplish that, then that opens the door to be able to have industrialization, because nobody can move to the city and get jobs in a factory unless there's enough food so that they don't starve to death, all right? So in England, you have the first thing that happens is you have an agricultural revolution. Machinery and things go to the farms. They make them, food is grown much more efficiently. There's a change in the law. There's a law known as Enclosure. Long story short, the impact of the Enclosure Law is that you start seeing smaller farms go out of business, and you see fewer farms, but the farms that are left are much bigger. Okay, so there are fewer farms, but the farms that are left are much bigger. Why is that important? Well, when you have a bigger farm, you generally can grow foods much more efficiently. If you have a tiny farm, there's no reason for you to invest in a lot of machinery. For example, there's a machine known as a seed drill. This is something that you can push, and the machine automatically makes a hole in the ground, and it puts the seed into the holes, and it covers the seed up. And it's just very quick. You zip down and you put the seeds in. Now, if you have a tiny farm, you're not going to invest in a seed drill. You're just going to plant the things by hand. It doesn't make sense to invest in this very expensive machine. But if you have a very, very large farm, the amount of work it would take to put all those seeds in the ground is so much that it makes sense to mechanize. It makes sense to invest in machines to get the work done faster and more efficiently. So that's the importance of enclosure. Crop rotation. What happens is in the old days, we had something known as the three-field system. You might remember this from 9th grade. This is where you cut the land into 3 spaces. In 2 of the spaces, you grow food. In the 3rd space, you leave that space open. That's land left for grazing, for the animals to graze on. And you basically allow the land to rest. And that's what allows the land to stay fertile. That you're still able to grow food there. If you keep growing food on the same piece of land over and over and over again, eventually the land runs out of nutrients and the food doesn't grow anymore. So with the 3-field system, that's a way to get the land to stay fertile. what ends up happening is, I mean, it works, but the problem with the three field system is, by definition, you're only using 2/3 of the land. You have a huge amount of land that just sits there doing nothing. So the crop rotation method basically took the same plot of land, but instead of cutting it into 3 pieces, you cut it into 4 pieces, and each field is growing food. But the key is that you have to grow different foods each year. You can't grow the same crop over and over again on the same piece of land. But what happens is, what they figured out is certain plants take nutrients out of the soil and put different nutrients back in. So long story short, you're putting in like you need to have certain foods that, like, let's say they eat nutrient A and put back nutrient B. The next year you're going to have a plant that, eats nutrient A and leaves behind nutrient B. You get what I'm saying? And as long as you keep doing that, the land stays fertile. So that's another thing. And like I said, between enclosure, which is creating larger farms, crop rotation, which allows you to use all of the land, and the inventions that mechanize farm work, suddenly the same amount of land is producing many, many, many more crops. All right, much more food. Now, this is great. What happens is, though, as you have these farms that are much more efficient, you need fewer workers. People who normally would work in agriculture, people who used to work as farmers, now no longer have jobs. They're not needed on the farms. So what are they going to do? They're going to move to the city to look for work. And that's where we get to the second piece, where this this huge labor force that England has, it has all these workers available to move to the city. They're desperate for work, and they'll work cheap. This is going to lead to something known as urbanization. Urbanization is this idea that the populations, that cities go from very, very tiny, something like there's one city where it went from 50,000 people to 500,000 people. I mean, the rate of growth of some of these cities is beyond belief, where there's just people just start flooding in and the cities become very, very crowded. And this is where you have the rise of tenements, and you have slums and people living in very, very tiny apartments in horrible conditions, a lot of pollution, overcrowding, things like that. But these are some of the issues with urbanization, with all of these people going to the city looking for work. All right, the other big reason why why the Industrial Revolution starts in England is because of the availability of raw materials. I should say United Kingdom, has a lot of coal and iron ore, as well as rivers. The rivers are really important because the first source of power for the Industrial Revolution was the water wheel. So if you have rivers move a water wheel, and that produces electricity. Rivers are also important because it allows them to transport goods up and down throughout this whole area. So not only just have rivers, but also the coal and the iron ore obviously are huge raw materials, allowing for the factories to produce goods. In addition, if you remember, England also has a lot of colonies, so it's able to get raw material from its colonies, and it's going to trade with other places to get what other things that it needs. All right, suffice to say, if you have to remember anything about why the Industrial Revolution starts in England, these are the top 3. These are the 3 most important reasons why the Industrial Revolution starts in England. They're not the only reasons, but they are the most important, all right? Other reasons why are inventions. So there's the steam engine is invented, the spinning jenny. There's many, many other, like I said, the seed drill. And you can think of the inventions first. You had a scientific revolution way back when. This is a culture that's going to support education and scientific achievement. And like I said, there's great scientific, these inventions allow for industrialization to happen. Transportation, like I just said before, there's a lot of rivers that run through England. You're also going to end up having canals being built. It has ocean access, which makes transportation of raw materials and goods to market. That makes it even easier. And later in the Industrial Revolution, they're going to start developing railroads, and you're going to see railroad tracks all throughout the United Kingdom, England. Then we're going to move on to the Commercial Revolution. Commercial Revolution is something you should have learned about in 9th grade. Long story short, Commercial Revolution just talks about the fact that during the Age of Exploration, one of the big things you had was the development of banks, financial instruments, insurance companies, things like that. They were developed during the age of exploration to give ships, like there was even like, what are they called? What's it called? Where you have stock markets, and these, these different companies. Anyway, this had helped with exploration, allowing companies, allowing investors to be able to invest in shipping. But now these same tools are now going to be able to be used by business people to finance new companies and new ventures. The final reason why the Industrial Revolution starts in England, and you can think of this as political support. Long story short, England has a very stable government, and this is a government that is going to support the development of businesses. We're going to learn later about the idea of laissez-faire, and this idea that the government does not get itself involved in business. So the laws and things like that were created to support business and support the growth of business. All right, the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and there are many of them, as you can see. Let's start at the top, and then we're going to go around like clockwise. So the first one we're going to talk about is, again, as I said, the growth of large cities with urbanization, that the places are going to get much more crowded, overcrowded. There's going to be disease, and there's going to be, like I said, severe overcrowding. People are going to live in tenements, so on and so forth. Pollution. People have said that climate change, what's happening right now in climate change, they trace climate change back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. That the pollution that's generated by all of these machines release so much carbon into the atmosphere, and that's what's causing climate change today. So this pollution has really long-term effects. It's a motive for imperialism. Imperialism is something you're going to learn about later. Long story short, imperialism is where you take over, you make a colony of a foreign country. And the reason why you want to colonize another country is that if you take over that country, you can take their raw materials. So you take their raw materials, and now you can use them in your factories. In addition, having control of another country means you can force them to buy your stuff. So they become a market for your goods. So between raw materials and being a market for your goods, that is going to encourage imperialism. And we're going to talk a lot about that in the next unit, so don't worry about that. The growth of the working class as well as the middle class, this is huge. Remember, like I said, before the Industrial Revolution, the majority of the population worked in agriculture. But now, most people are going to start becoming working class people. They're going to start moving towards factories. Middle class really was a very, very small group in agriculture. There were only very small groups of people who lived in towns and were kind of craftsmen. Now there is a huge group of people who are going to be considered what they call white-collar workers. These are people who are going to be employed as clerks, as managers. They're going to run businesses and so forth. And these middle-class people get much more financial power, much more social power. They live much, a couple of generations ago, they would have been peasant farmers. And many people in the middle class, they start getting, like I said, much more money, much more social status. They're going to fight for more political rights. And some members of the middle class are actually going to make so much money that they're going to be upper class. They're going to make a lot more money. And the upper class, the nature of the upper class is going to change. Before the Industrial Revolution, the people who had great wealth, the only way you could get great wealth was to own land. And that meant you were a lord, that you were some kind of nobility. Suddenly, wealth won't be tied to land ownership, it'll be tied to business ownership. And so some members of the middle class can actually move up, and that's a huge change, social change. New economic theories, communism, utilitarianism, Malthus. We're going to talk about those economic theories later in much more detail, I think in the part 2 of this video. Suffice to say, this growth of business is, like I said, it's going to lead to new theories about how wealth should be created and distributed within society. The abuse of workers and the growth of slums. Again, I talked about this a little bit in the urbanization piece, but again, the working conditions were horrible, okay? Most of the jobs in factories did not require a high degree of skill. So, if a worker gets injured, you just send them out the door. You kick them out the door and you hire somebody else to take their spot. There is There's no laws requiring you to have any kind of safety procedures in place. And there's no reason for you to do it. So workers are working 14 hours, 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week in horrible working conditions. They're getting all kinds of diseases, all kinds of injuries. There's a huge rise of child labor. Women are forced to work. It's pretty terrible conditions. So they're really exploited, and they're given no rights. The reason why this changes is, and that brings us to our next circle, labor unions. What happens is as the workers start getting abused, they start to come together to form labor unions. And this is where there's something known as collective bargaining. If you as an individual go to your boss and you say, I would like a raise, it's very easy for the boss to turn around and say, no. In fact, I'm so pissed at you for asking, you're fired. And then they get rid of you. What a labor union does is, instead of one person going, every member of the factory comes together as a group and they say, we need a raise. And the boss says no, then you say, we won't work then. Now, you boss are going to lose money. Your factory is going to stop working because we refuse to work. We're going to go on strike. And not only are we going to stop working, we're going to encourage people to not buy your goods. We're not going to allow you to hire new people. We're going to, stand strong until you give in to our demands. And it is the work of labor unions that have the biggest impact on helping to change conditions inside the factories. In addition, eventually the government is going to respond, and the government is going to step in and change the law to protect workers and to outlaw things like child labor, or to limit working hours, or limit and change the laws to protect workers and to put some limits on the businesses. The changing role of women and children. Again, women, before the Industrial Revolution, women were forced to work at home. They might work, let's say, on the family farm. They never had an independent source of income. They never had any kind of economic power, economic control of their lives. Suddenly now, especially in the mills, a lot of women would go out and earn money and then contribute into the households, gave them a certain sense of independence. And this is going to translate into women wanting more rights and more power, not just economically, but socially and politically. So you're going to start to see the rise of what they call the suffrage movement, women's suffrage. And suffrage, it doesn't mean to suffer. Suffrage means the right to vote. All right, and so you're going to start seeing a push for women to also have the right to vote. So it's changing their role. Children also are going to change. At this point in history, before the Industrial Revolution and going on, children were thought of as small adults. That children worked on the family farm. They had the same responsibility as adults. They were expected to act like adults. There was this this idea of childhood. This idea that children need to be educated, children need to have this, period of their lives where they're free of responsibility. This idea of childhood that we have today, this actually starts during the Industrial Revolution, where people start saying that that children should not be forced to work 12 and 14 hours a day, and that this is wrong, and that children need a time. There's like a push to give children education and things like that. And this idea of childhood, this idea actually gets invented during the Industrial Revolution. And finally, this idea of cheaper and faster goods. The Industrial Revolution, as brutal as it is, actually leads to better a rise in better what do they call it? A rise in conditions for the people. It actually improves people's lives. Like they economically, people can afford more goods. A rise in living standards, I think that's the phrase for it, where people can afford goods, something like clothing and things like that. Now that these goods are produced faster in the factory, it brings the prices down. So more people can afford more goods, and it actually has a rise in living standards for generally considered that across although some people do badly in the Industrial Revolution, no doubt, but generally speaking, across the culture, um, uh, most people, the majority of the population actually does better and has a rise in living standards thanks to the Industrial Revolution. All right. When we look at these issues of the Industrial Revolution, just bear in mind they're not over. Okay, the Industrial Revolution isn't something that took place, back in the 1800s and 1900s, and now it's over. Different areas of the world have industrialized at different rates. What we're seeing in China and India and parts of Africa today is these countries are struggling to industrialize, to rapidly industrialize. And what we're seeing in many of these countries today are the same problems that Europe faced back in the 1800s and the 1900s. So, for example, the problems of urbanization, pollution, the growth of the middle class, abuse of workers in slums. We're seeing that here. If you see that top left picture with the green water, that's in China. China has been struggling with really bad pollution in the top left and the bottom right. They're pretty infamous for it, that you walk out, if you visit China, like as soon as you step off the plane, your throat starts hurting because there's so much air pollution, and rivers are just filled with filth and so on and so forth. The other two pictures, the one on the right and one with the little boy, again, child labor is endemic in China and Africa. And these pictures are actually from India, where you can see there's a lot of child labor still going on today. The picture on the right, this is also from, this could actually be South America, but I think this one's taken from India, where you see this huge income inequality. That you have some people who would be the ones living in those skyscrapers who are getting really, really rich thanks to industrialization. But yet many people within the working class are very, very poor, living in slums. And obviously they would be the ones living in the shacks. And on the bottom left, you can see, again, the UN finds that more than half of people now live in cities. Again, that urbanization, that we're starting to see more and more population leaving the country, moving to the cities. And that has huge ramifications for society and social things, social classes. And you start seeing people moving away from the more traditional, old-fashioned values, taking on new ideas and new cultures, more cultural diffusion, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's the end of part one. Please tune in to part two, where I will continue to discuss this topic.